Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 434th New Social Environment. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Joel Shapiro and Michael Brenson. We're thrilled to have the poet Hazem Fahmy here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. Here at the Rail, we're celebrating our 21st anniversary by working on our first ever endowment campaign. This initiative will ensure the print edition of the Rail and our public programming celebrating cross-pollination in the arts, humanities, and sciences all remain free and accessible for generations to come. Please check the chat for more information and links. And the Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we're on the Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Since 1970, Joel Shapiro has created work that activates and reconfigures space with his iconic vocabulary of geometric forms. He's executed more than 30 publicly cited sculptures across Asia, Europe, and North America, and has been the subject of numerous one-person and retrospective exhibitions. Shapiro's work can be found in international public collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Tate Gallery, London, and the Centre Pompidou, Paris. And art critic, scholar, and curator Michael Brenson was an art critic for the New York Times and has curated exhibitions at MoMA PS1 and the Sculpture Center. He has been a Getty Scholar, Guggenheim Fellow, Bugliasco Fellow, and Clark Fellow. For many years, he was a member of the sculpture faculty in Bard College's Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts and a visiting senior critic in the University of Pennsylvania School of Design's Department of Fine Arts. His biography, David Smith, The Art and Life of a Transformational Sculptor, will be published in October of 2022. He is the artistic director of the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. So without further ado, please, Joel and Michael, take it away.
Well, thank you, Anya, and thank you, Fong and Nick and the Rail for inviting Joel and me to be part of your wonderful New Social Environment series. Your invitation gives us a chance to talk about Joel's beautiful show, and it's also an opportunity for us to reactivate a conversation that we've had that's been going on since the 80s and then well into the 90s about sculpture, and actually, continued in bits and pieces on 3 continents. Joel is one of a handful of people I know with whom I can talk about sculpture in its totality. And what I mean by that is not just talking about how sculpture is made and how it's made and its concepts and how it works and and contemporary and modern sculpture, but all of sculpture. So we can talk about, we're interested in what we see in museums, and we're also interested in what we see in public parks and squares and the kinds of bronze statues and memorials that people normally don't want to talk about. And one of the interesting things for me in going and reading about Joel's work again and reading the interviews with him is to see his receptiveness to all kinds of sculpture, and that he can find ideas and forms in official sculptures and the 19th century, and again, sculpture that people don't normally look at, and find something vital in that. I first saw Joel's work in 1982. I had been living in Paris since from 1975 to 1982. And in between 1980 and 1982, I saw a lot of new American art, but all of it was painting. And I remember Barbara Rose's American painting of the 80s, and I remember seeing paintings by Robert Moskowitz and Julian Schnabel and Susan Rothenberg. Rothenberg's in particular had a big effect on me. So the New York Times hired me and brought me back to New York in the spring of 1982. And they assigned me to write articles in those first few months uh, on Noguchi and Lichtenstein and Ellsworth Kelly and Louise Bourgeois, all great artists, all of whom, obviously made sculpture. But none of that sculpture really stuck with me, and in an intense way, and in a way that made me want to think about sculpture as sculpture. So all that changed when I saw Joel's show at the Whitney in 1982, and at the end of 1982. And, though that little 3-inch iron chair, and those tiny iron houses that looked like Monopoly board houses, and that tiny little iron bridge, and then that crazy little house that was stuck on the wall with the path leading out of the house. Well, I'd never seen anything like that, and all of it was the scale of the hand. All of it had a little bit of a quality of, it was perceptual and it was psychological, and there was an element of danger about it, and it reconnected me with the thinking I'd done in Paris about Giacometti and his tiny sculptures that he made during the war. And he put these little sculptures in a room, and they took over the room and completely changed the space in them. And it also reconnected me with all the looking I had done about African art and Etruscan art and Egyptian art and Sardinian art and Asian art. In other words, the sculpture for me had an ancient quality to it, and something in it about the way sculpture used to function, and a kind of particular power that it had across the centuries, all of it within a completely contemporary sensibility and mentality. So they raised questions for me, like, what were these things I was looking at? Were they absurd? Were they provocative? Were they dangerous? If I were to place them in my apartment on the floor, what would they do? What effect would they have on my life? What would happen? So, and these questions that Joel's sculpture raised for me then, they're still raising for me now. And they're questions, what do I see, and what are the wonders of vision? What are the limits of vision? How do they act on space? Do they want to have some kind of impact on the people around them, on the space around them? Do they want to retreat into themselves? Are they personal or impersonal? Are they permanent? Are they impermanent? Are they anti-monuments or monuments? So I felt, given the potency of these questions that Joel's work has always raised, it seemed to me the best way to begin would be to actually ask Joel to talk about sculpture, and to talk about what made him want to be a sculptor. So Joel, I turn it over for you and anything that you want to say, but I would love to begin with these questions of how it all began.
Yikes. Well, I was really drawn to sculpture because I think because of its factualness. It's a fact, but it refers to other things. It's not illusionistic, although sculpture can be illusionistic, and also is made by hand. It's something I could do. It wasn't, it's less, sculpture is less abstract in some broad sense than painting. And painting is always illusionistic. It's always in reference, it's a two-dimensional reference to something else. And in the 1960s, sculpture was indeed, at least to my eye, the most exciting work around. And also, I understood the vocabulary or I misunderstood. I knew enough to understand it, but actually misunderstand it. It was an exciting moment to work. I had studied some sculpture in high school and made stuff, and in painting classes, I never painted, I made sculpture. Anyway, but I think it was that the quality, of the factual quality of it, the material quality of it interested me. Not the material itself. The material itself interested me too, but but the physicality of sculpture was engaging, and the way it functions in space. I mean, it functions in the same space you occupy, which I always thought was a certain factualness or realness about sculpture that engaged me.
What did you see when you were growing up in, because you grew up in New York, right? And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
when you were sort of roaming around the city or going to museums, what were the sculptures you saw?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I definitely saw the now shipped away Theodore Roosevelt in front of the Museum of Natural History. And I went to the Modern a lot, and I went to the Museum of Natural History. My parents both went to museums, and I went willfully. I may have been more interested in rocks and minerals and seashells and animals. But as I became, I mean, all these things affect you. So it wasn't as if, I went from Queens to Manhattan. It wasn't like, it was all within the same city.
So what was the relation between the sculpture that you saw in museums and the sculpture that you saw like in the parks? Because you mentioned that Teddy Roosevelt sculpture outside the Museum of Natural History.
Well, I was always, I mean, I've always been, drawn to monuments. What is it? So, I mean, it's just as a fact, I wasn't judging them as a kid sculpturally, but they just interested me. I mean, that kind of more so than painting. But I don't think there's anything specific, until I was older, until particular sculptures that engaged me. I mean, I remember walking into the Robert Morris show at Green Gallery. I think it was 64, 65, which I found totally fascinating and I'm sure formative. And there are actually suspended pieces in that show. I mean, in retrospect, but that was a long time ago. But I spent 2 years in India and looked at a massive amount of sculpture. And that was probably more formative than anything else in terms of my commitment to sculpture.
Can you say why?
Hmm?
Can you say why? What it was about?
Well, I mean, because you'd see, just going to Ellora and Mahabalipuram, and these were sort of temple complexes that one was carved out of stone, the other was additive. It was carved but additive. One was carved out of a solid rock. I mean, really kind of, you had a certain sense of the importance of sculpture culturally. I don't think, maybe here, yes, looking at statuary, but, in India, it seemed all important.
So was it more that than that in terms of something that made you want to make sculpture? Was that the main thing? I mean, what? Yeah.
Well, the haptic quality of sculpture, I think my early work was all about the hand and making things and tools and sort of relatively simple processes and sort of trying to figure out when something had meaning versus not having meaning. And that critical level of where there's some transition from being an object into a sculpture. I mean, something that has some kind of meaning in the world and communication and empathy and has some reason to exist that's not particularly utilitarian. So that narrow edge is really critical. And that's something I still investigate, when something's just a pile of sticks or you discover some meaningful form.
The 60s was, also you came into it on a moment where the field kind of broke open, right? You still had, David Smith died in 65 and minimalism was already underway. And then you had figurative sculptors like, Peter Agostini, who were still working. And then, you had the movement into happenings and earth art. So it was also a point where there was some kind of continuity, but that continuity was broken. And sculpture was something that had meaning, but it also had to be completely reinvented. So, and it seems to me that you've like incorporated into your work a very, broad sense of what sculpture can be, and that you're still, you're still responding to certain kinds of ideas that were alive then. So I'm wondering in terms of this very rich and very dynamic totality that you came into, how you oriented yourself in relation to that.
Well, I mean, I think, probably the critical show I had was that show where I showed that small chair and a horse and what else was in it? The house on the wall and a house and this and that. I mean, those are the things that I was making. And it was much more about somehow, some self-identity and transforming my experience or my sense of my experience at the time into form. And there was no reason for them to be monumental. That seemed to be something that was, to some extent, lacking a little bit in sculpture. I mean, so that was sort of, insisting on that bridge, at Alana's gigantic clock tower and not making it larger to satisfy, so I think the scale in the work was about, a private discourse that was now public or put into a public space. And I think that degree of intimacy was interesting to see at that moment. So, and yes, it did condense space. I mean, Giacometti was always an artist who interested me. I mean, Giacometti, Brancusi to some extent.
At the same time as Morris and Andre. Like
yeah, I was interested in that language and admired the work of minimalists. So, Bob and Judd and Saul. And all that work was important to me. And it also was a kind of vocabulary, a language that, I began to use. I understood it, I thought. I do understand. And Tony Smith interested me. And I'm somebody I'm sort of always doubting my own work or doubting what trying to analyze what I don't know, but I'm interested in pushing the work, at least I want to be engaged with it. It's difficult. I mean, there are moments when, really.
Maybe it's a good time to begin to look at the show.
Sure.
Joel, do you want to sort of just, before we settle in?
Yes. Well, it's hard, the piece on the left of the screen is a very small bronze. mean, I tend to put stuff together with pin guns and hot glue. I don't use hot glue anymore. I use epoxy. But I think what I've been trying to question in sculpture maybe is the role of gravity and how flatness conditions form. And there's one aspect of minimalism that was totally engaging and also, at least for me, limiting, and that was its correspondence with architecture, whether a correspondence to the flatness, to the tabletop. I think it's not minimalism, all sculpture. You know, certain artists project their thought onto a flat surface rather than organize the form independent of a surface. So I've been more interested in the independence of the surface and the possibility of finding a meaningful form, or a form that, let's say a form that engages me. And I've been looking a long time, you know, but if I'm working on a tabletop, it's like, so you're building up anti-gravity. I mean, I'd rather organize something in space and then find a place where it can sit down.
That's the only bronze piece in the show, right? The one on the left. Everything else is.
Yeah, that was a direct burnout of a piece that was put together with, you know, pin guns and wood.
Mm-hmm.
So I put it in the show because it has color. I didn't want to confuse color with paint. I mean, everything has color. That's the only bronze. And I would have, you know, I'm sure I'm exaggerating. I'm sure I've worked on a tabletop, but I would have inverted it, ripped one part off, stuck it somewhere else. I mean, I'm trying to, you know, enliven the form or find some meaning in the form. The other one, the large blue piece, is it blue now or what? Or after all blue? Terrible with titles.
Blue. Mm-hmm.
All right. I made those in relationship to an exhibit. They were kind of commissioned by the Nasher Museum, the Nasher Sculpture Center. And they were initially exhibited in this beautiful Renzo piano space. Marble walls, light on both sides, really phenomenal. But, you know, but I actually think they're a way of making form. I don't think these were, maybe that one's stacked, the blue one, right? There's something down on the ground. But I could have inverted that piece. And in fact, this bronze, I have a similar form on the wall in my studio. And it's mounted, I mean, it sort of hits the wall from an entirely different place. So there's a certain freedom in the work.
Why did you cast that piece in bronze? Because you have other wood constructions in the show that we're going to talk about, but what would make you cast that one and not the other ones? And I sort of wonder, when you're building it too in wood, whether you have, at what point you have an idea that you want to cast this in bronze.
Oh, I decided to cast that way after. I mean, I was much more interested in the form, you know, finding some form that was engaging. And number one, it was castable, and I thought it would make a great casting.
So does it change the form when you see it in bronze? Does it change your experience of the
Well,
form?
it gives it a certain weight and presence. I mean, bronze has an association. And, you know, in this case, I don't use a patina, so it's kind of pretty straight. You know, it's just cast and bead blasted and filed here and there. So you have an absolute sense that it was wood. I mean, it has that sense of memory. Yeah, but the form intrigued me. It's also it's sort of a form that still engages me. It seems to have fairly loaded with a great amount of possibility. It's hard to make any larger. There's no real need to.
So when you talk about form there, I mean, for people will look at that and they see what multiple parts. So the form that you're talking about is like a kind of gestalt, the way all the different parts relate together, or is it something, is it like form, but also like a multitude of forms there? Like what, since it's a
I
single.
think in this case, it's complicated enough. There's a multitude of forms, but you know, there's no specific narrative I'm interested in. And I don't have a preconception when I begin to work. So I'm just sticking stuff together fast. I'm using pneumatic pin guns that they use in the furniture trade. They shoot very fine wire. I'm mostly trying to join two pieces of wood without my finger getting involved. And then, and the reason I'm doing that is because the one piece of wood doesn't connect to a facet of another piece of wood. Generally, the connections are not, they don't join together. Sometimes they do. So the pins are kind of holding it together. And then if I go in with epoxy, it's sort of like pre-stressed concrete. So these flexible pins become stiff. At that point, you know, you can cast the piece. If I'm going to paint the piece, I might remake the piece. Because in wood, this piece would not exist. I mean, it would hold up, but it would be so fragile. So the bronze actually, in a way, allows you to make something that otherwise would not be there. And this was just a study, you know, that I thought was particularly engaging, and I gave it to the founder and he did it. He cast it.
Anya, let's go to the next one. Yeah, so this is the room on the left that you were kind of looking into in the last image.
Right, and you know, this is the orange pieces and earlier. I don't have dates on the pieces. That's too bad. I don't know what the one that's from. 71? Early 2004, 2003. This one, this table that's spilling out. Now that's a piece where I actually had the table on a table, swirled and piled up studio debris until it configured and got compressed, and then thought it was idiotic, so hung it upside down, and where all this stuff is kind of falling off.
You're talking about the piece at the far left.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then,
and the blue piece and this little pink piece, those are models, right?
well, there were studies. I mean, I don't know, you know, it's very hard to say model study. I mean, the fact is, the blue one was generally, the blue one could be seen as a study for this larger sculpture that was commissioned by FATE, Friends of Art and Preservation of Embassies, for the US Southern, I guess it would be the Southern Consulate in Guangzhou in China. And that was, the committee came to my studio and I had a bunch of models around. They loved that one. The reason why is because the piece has a certain degree of freedom that other pieces would not have necessarily. And plus it was far less conventional. I mean, most people want a figure, or they want something they could recognize, or recognize some reflection of self in.
Can we go on to the next one? We'll come back to that.
Well, this is the most recent, well, lead up. This is work I did last spring and this summer. Again, I was just joining wood together with pin guns one. But I think it's hard to come up with a form that means something. It's like, you can put a million sticks together. Generally, you're inhibited, or most people are. And I am too. I have to overcome, the limitations of joining and this and that. In these pieces, I was particularly interested in how they touch down, right? So I would, subsequent to doing the piece, I would find a place to suspend it from, because none of these would hold up if they're suspended on their own. I mean, the limitation of gravity is the string, or what the cordage is really about, that admission that, these are not physically strong sculptures. Even the one on the 2 wine boxes, I didn't make it. I thought those bases were right next to the sculpture in the studio. So, I mean, I think what's interesting about these, there's a certain acknowledgement of their vulnerability because of the degree of suspension. And I also think it gives them a kind of moment or animateness.
I had a like strong reaction to these pieces, which is partly why I wanted to focus on them. I mean, I've seen a lot of work by you over the years where I get involved in the process of making, where I could see this, where there's this, and then there's that. And then you're kind of working with all of it, like almost like a child. There's like a sense of discovery of the pieces of wood. And it's very easy to get into the process of these works. And I felt that there's something so engaging or infectious in the act of making them. Like these are sculptures, and I wish in a way it's harder to see from slides, but they make me want to make things, and they give me a basic sense of like the discovery, or what can happen when anybody, and it's very democratic, where anybody sits down at a table with just some scraps of wood, and you start to put this here, and then you put there, and that there, and then that there, and then eventually you've got something, and it can surprise you, and that you didn't know before. So there's something about this childlike wonder, a way of beginning from scratch each time that you've got some scraps or planks of woods to get wood together, that I felt very strongly here. And there are not many things I see that make me want to construct or build, but these sculptures did.
Well, thank you. Well, I do think children make wonderful work, and they get taught not to. Mm-hmm. Or they get inhibited, or their parents throttle them, or somebody, I don't know. So, I mean, I do think there is that, there's a certain moment of real joy that you strive for. And when I'm working, I mean, at first it doesn't work and you're miserable. I mean, it all becomes and then you have moments where you have some real sense of, rapture. A small sense of rapture that, oh, I've really done, that's really something. This pink one was a dog. I mean, the top was hanging in the studio for 2 years. And then I finally added this bottom piece and had it touch the ground, and it really became tender. And the color helps. The color kind of unifies the form. It sort of draws it out of the child, or out of the Kinderkunst mode.
Can you talk about the color, because it seems almost like the construction itself to come out of the blue in a way, like what?
Well, listen. These were originally made out of individual. I was using color. Let's say I have a pile of form in the studio. Some of it scrapped, some of it I made, some I taken boards and painted them and then chopped them up on the table saw. And all this stuff is laying around and I'm grabbing it to put stuff together. So, and then these were remade and painted, you know, monolithically, sort of. They're not monolithic, but they're painted individual color. And actually they're better. I mean, they really work. And the other ones now look juvenile compared to these are very sophisticated.
And how do you get at the lime green, for example? Like where do you decide that that's a color you're going to use for that? I mean, is that like intuitive or just happens?
No, it's all intuitive. I mean, you know, I tried different colors. Well, I painted another piece using that, I guess it's nickel yellow, which is an unusual color. And it just kind of intrigues me. It's sort of unfamiliar. And I use color according to the form, but I can't, there's no formula. I can't possibly explain it. I mean, I picked cobalt violet for the one on the wine boxes. And then you struggle with the paint. You know, it's like you could kill the form too. You can overpaint it. I'm using casein. You can really overpaint, put on so much paint. You know, I think I'm very careful about the sort of paint I use. And I want the wood to show through. So I don't want to deny its woodiness. And you know, it's strictly what time of year and whatever I've been experiencing, how I would pick color.
You use the word like vulnerability. I mean, I think of a certain provisionality, certainly the provisionality of these works. They're in sort of one moment, but they're almost between moments, and they're almost like trying out that moment, like the sculpture on the floor, which sort of extends the rectangle, almost like you're trying just before you put a foot in the water, or a child before he or she takes its step. So that there's a tentativeness to it, which is really interesting. I mean, you used the word doubt earlier, and I'm trying to think of how doubt and vulnerability and then provisionality and this notion of trying, like I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this move, I'm going to try this step, and this sense of trying things, it's there throughout this work. It's just really interesting to me.
Well, it's tough to make stuff. I mean, you sit there and you don't know what to do unless you're doing something that's depictive, and this is not depictive. So I don't know. I'm just trying to invent, in my own small way, some sort of organization of form that expresses what I'm feeling. But yes, I think it's the string becomes the admission of, there's a certain tenderness and poise to this work. And they're like, I actually was impressed with this room. I'm not always impressed with my own work. I mean, it's just like, oh, that really looks good. Let's see if I can do that again. I wonder. Anyway, yeah, I think the recognition of, what you're doing, and then understanding it is critical. And I think that the string was, I had the piece in a vise. And I said, well, I'm going to string this thing up. And so that becomes this critical, important aspect. If those things were nailed, if that was steel, believe me, it wouldn't have the same. It would be sort of, they wouldn't have, if it was welded together, it would not have any effect. Effect, I don't know.
Anya, can we go to the next one? Yeah, so.
Gee, I could drag this computer in my studio to show you the other one. made out of different colors. But I'm not going to do it. It's too complicated. I think in this one, I painted and removed a lot of the paint. I think as it got so painted and so kind of monolithic in the paint that it deadened the work. So I had to bring it back to wood. I don't know what color.
We go to the next one.
Zirconium blue, oh, this one. Now, I did subsequently paint the table white on the other side just to differentiate. But you know, this was stuff I did. I know this is going to sound post 9/11, and I was interested in the form. I was interested in the limitation of my own form, and you know, it's like wanting to split stuff up and break stuff up, and invert things, and how meaningless it was. So I began making stuff. Joining things together with string and then wrapping them around each other, just trying to find a freer organization of form. It's a horrible thing to say, I sound like. But you know, looking at the photographs, I really realized just how, you know, what kind of play artists are involved with when they're dealing with destruction and collapse. And it made everything seem, much of what I had done seemed extremely superficial. So this was some attempt to get some real sense of collapse and walk.
You just, and Jan, you just show the next one, and then because it's a close up of it. Yeah.
And I painted the table white recently. That was a late decision. That was a 2021 decision.
So this notion of collapse, you had spoken about it before, and
Well, it wasn't so much, it was like, how do you organize the forms underneath? I mean, how do you find that? You don't sit there, take one form and pin it into the next form, and then pin the third into the second form, and then the fourth into the third group, and you don't build that way. I mean, and if you do build that way, it's stiff and programmatic. So I was interested in a more radical form that had more to do with gravity. And I did, you know, for years I was working that way. Before that, I'd hold something up in space and then get some supports, crocos, you know, they use in kabuki, and staple, you know, screw them into wood. And, you know, anything that was this intellectual became too descriptive rather than actual found with the sense of the more radical sense.
was this originally right side up, like the table, and then you?
I think it was, and then I flipped it over.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was right side up. I don't remember, but I'm just, and that's a good story anyway. So, you know, so I flipped it around and it all fell down. But there were other pieces where one piece is wrapping another piece. That piece at the D'Orsay, you know, those are all kind of discovered by sort of twisting wire and then altering it to some extent, wrapping one string of wood around a larger form, but literally doing it in the air, not on the tabletop. So, you know, I think, you know, flatness is just, maybe it's great for painting.
I just wonder, like, again, I'm coming back to this word collapse, because you had used it before. It's a word you know that sculptors kind of struggle with, and And then you had 9/11, and obviously there's a very, collapse is a very different and much more catastrophic
Yeah, it was hard.
notion to it. And so it's just really interesting for me that somehow in a sculpture like this, which is a relatively small sculpture, that it could actually carry with it a kind of significance or impact of that would take an idea that you've dealt with before and you've dealt with again, but maybe at that particular moment it shows up in the sculpture in a different way.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're always, I mean, as you evolve, you absorb what's around you. It influences work.
Mhm. Anya, let's go on.
This is the most recent work in the show. And this also was a model. God, I could bring the model. Is that Jonathan's that model or? It's on the ground floor for you. It was a small model I did this summer. And this was after the painted wood pieces that we were just talking about, the ones that are poised and tender and this and that. And I just wanted, I was interested in getting more depth in a more complicated form. So I was deeply, willfully looking for that. And I thought this model really had a certain degree of complication and gravitas that engaged me. So I made it larger. Is that the only photograph we have?
There's one other.
Oh, that's close up. Yeah, okay, so in this case, the original one was joined with wire and it had different scraps of wood. It had walnut and mahogany. I didn't put any walnut in it because it's too woody. And I had made it a model with paint. I chopped up some painted pieces and used them as a kind of color reference in the work. So we can go back to the larger one. You got to really see this in the real world. This photograph doesn't
Right.
give you a sense because it kind of fills the space.
Well, it seems in this piece that the color, the sort of dense, almost phosphorescent color, puts a certain pressure on the forms of the wood to be equal to the impact of the color in a certain way.
And the wood, yeah. I was very careful about the wood. Sort of mahoganies, all that. That's all plantation grown mahogany, I'm sure. Or one hopes so. Anyway. It was environmentally okay versus cutting down trees in the Amazon, wild trees. Yeah, and the other wood is spruce, which is very light and does very little discernible grain. Yeah, I like this piece. It's like
it's hard to see in the photograph, but there really is something exquisite about the carpentry in this work. And yeah, the way the wood is cut and the way they're joined and then and pieced together, like you've got sort of the far horizontal form, which is actually open so that it's filled. And I just like the element of the exquisite skill in the work compared with the provisional quality of the making of the work in the room beside it. It's like two very different things.
Yeah, well, I worked with my studio assistant, who's a master woodworker, on this piece. I sort of my big concern was painting the work, which I painted, and then how the work joins together, because in the joining together, it can become stiff and leaden. And since instead of pin guns and epoxy, now you have to use wedges. and how do those wedges interact, and how do you still have a sense of that? How do you still break up the continuity using those wedges? So one piece doesn't pull off another piece, and it's a delicate dance. But I've worked on it to some extent. I mean, to a large extent. But the model, of course, with any conception is mine. But there's no way in hell that I could turn out a piece like that. I'm pretty good with wood, but I don't. The Ichiro is really beyond the beyond.
Do you think about, because this question that I sort of wanted to raise about the monument and the anti-monument, and this piece, which has something of the rhetoric of a monument, even perhaps kind of war memorial, I don't know, but with the aggressiveness of the projections going in different directions, but also like a piece that's sort of collapsing, in upon itself, so that the gestures really just maintain a kind of rhetorical pathos. And so the monument is here, but it's transformed and kind of undone in a way. And I wonder whether you feel like this line of thinking is completely like inappropriate or outside your mind when you're making it. Yeah.
I don't think it was so outside my mind. I was thinking about a friend who recently died when I was making this piece. And so, is it a monument? Is it for somebody? I mean, so it has a kind of, I mean, it has that sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it has a kind of commemorative sense.
The other ones do not. The other four we looked at don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So this had a kind of deeper quality in terms of the form and a greater degree of complication. It definitely is not light it's not light and buoyant. And it's the same thing in the small model, has the same quality, but you can't refute the form. That would be the word that I'm interested in. I mean, if you can't refute the form, at least if I can't, then I think it's really something good. Or something new, at least for me. The whole idea of monuments was really interesting. I mean, they're far and few between, they're any good. And now, without unless you're dealing with some collective experience, it's hard to do something. Anyway.
Anya, let's go on to just jump the next image to, yeah.
Now these are buoyant.
Mm.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say, they're made out of a kind of mahogany skeleton inside, the way you'd build a model airplane, and then it's aircraft plywood painted. So this relatively light. And they're painted with casein. Carefully. I mean, I wouldn't say they're carefully, but they're freely painted, but I think about the color and the surface.
And you thought about those three forms together, those three sculptures together.
Well, in this room, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, I showed 4 plus another one, 5 at the Nasher Museum. And one was a kind of negative space piece. But somehow I was creating the volume using 3 or 4 planes, which is always antithetic to this.
Anya, can you show the next one? And maybe the next one after that, and then go back to this one. Yeah.
Well, in this case, I'm joining, surface to surface to surface. Which of course I've been ranting away that I never do that, but here you go. So it's sort of a stacked, 5 stacked shapes. Interesting.
This work makes me want to ask a question about how the memory of sculpture, or the history of sculpture, actually functions or come into your work, because like in this work there are definitely traces of other people and other work, I think, as much as any other work in the show, but they here as traces, they're not here as
Well, definitely the traces of Tony Smith.
Mm.
Anything that's hollow, I mean, it has hollowness. Hollowness has its own kind of romantic quality.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking, the form language itself, there's certainly like a David Smith, cue by here. And, I'd mentioned to you the way it actually makes me think of a particular Puryear piece. And then even beyond that, and I know this is stretching it, but it's interesting to me, there's something about the head form and the body and the particular tilt of that head form that can take me back to photographs of Easter Island, or take me back, in other words, take me back to a more ritual kind of sculpture of a completely different time.
Well, I think, it's inevitable that there's a reiteration of form historically. I mean, people have been making this stuff, forever. Look at this. Can you see that? It's a hand axe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that there's this, I mean, it's just inevitable that form reiterates itself. I mean, sculptors are all working with the same set of parameters. I don't think the hand axe is a sculpture. It's an aesthetic object.
But the presence of the house form here seems clearly intentional, right? At the end of it, it's in the red piece as well. Like you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think they all. If you're using that kind of geometry, which is very, sort of, I was looking for. I had made all these forms at one point. I remember when I conceived of this piece, and they were all sitting in my studio. They were small, and they were kind of variations of a house. And then I kind of took them and joined them together. And that was the inception of the piece. In terms of any reference to anybody else, I really don't think it has much to do with, it has a lot to do with the history of art, the history of joining, the history of hollowness, but I don't think it has too much to do. And Brancusi, I mean, if you stick stuff together,
Mm-hmm.
you would think of it.
Anya, let's move on.
I mean, I think the way light affects it is really important, how they flatten out. I mean, maybe they have more to do with Ellsworth or something. But I don't think they're as individual as like the pieces in the pieces in that small room, all, and that kind of work, additive work like that has fairly, is the history of the 20th century. But I don't think they specifically refer to anybody.
The next one, the yellow one.
We have the red one.
Yeah, the red one's next. Yeah.
Originally, I showed the red one with the blue one. That was another section close by. That doesn't have to be that way. If these things look like anybody, they look like myself. I mean, that I'm copying myself. But there's this sort of exploration of that house form, which I did for quite a while.
Right.
You know, sort of.
But let's end with the sculptures for, yeah, the sculpture in Guangzhou. This was the model that, yeah, and this is the actual thing.
Yes, so this is in Guangzhou. This, I thought this, you know, I mean, I think one of the biggest issues in sculpture, making larger work, is, you know, how do you retain a certain haptic quality in the work? Of how you made the work. Does it manifest itself in the work? I think in this case, since all the forms are so, each form is so unique and individual, or at least the way it's organized, that sort of overcome, that couldn't, there's no rational reason to join anything. I mean, it's strictly a subjective expression. So I think this piece is very effective. I've had trouble with the paint. It's being repainted right now. I was using this new paint that in theory is totally flat. It was totally flat and also totally faded. So it had to get repainted. It's a nightmare painted sculpture. Okay.
Did you, is this the first big piece that you've done in aluminum? Or did you work with aluminum before?
I'm thinking. I had cast in aluminum before. I've never sort of worked with welded aluminum. I mean, welding a piece that size.
And how is that material different?
It's lighter.
Hmm?
It's lighter in weight. I mean, this is not cast. This is, you know, these sections are welded. So it's much lighter than bronze. There wouldn't be much sense. I mean, the problem with aluminum is highly reactive. I mean, it really can rot quick. If it accumulates water, the metal will rot away. I mean, it's very active metal. I don't think people are aware of that, but unless it's treated, I don't know. They use it for boats and whatnot. My experience with aluminum is needs a lot of care, and it's very soft.
So how do you, and maybe after this, you know, we should open it up, but so we looked at works in the gallery that are extremely provisional. And you've also done like a good number of significant public works that are permanent and much larger, and they can't fall apart. And I'm just wondering, like, it's such a different way of thinking, and how you think about the permanence here and the scale and the altogether different relationship that it's going to have to a public and the people around it, because this is, you know, inevitably by the size, it's a pretty dominating work, and and it's going to impose itself on the place that it's in, regardless of whatever haptic energy it has. This is like a completely different mentality for you as to.
No, I think the issue is more retaining that sense of play on a large scale. And in this piece, as I say, the parts would not have come together. No, any other. I can't look at that and say, oh, I would have done it this way or that way. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't, you know, I just think it's kind of a combination of the form that you can insist upon larger. In this case, the form happens to be good and you know, unexpected. And I think the public can read that. I mean, I don't think the public, in the right context, and I, you know, I try to avoid the colossal, for sure. That's another issue. I don't think my work's ever that large that it sort of imposes itself in an authoritarian sense. Or I try to avoid that. Or the components are understandable in terms of our experience, you know, human scale. So that combination, I think, avoids a kind of colossal one.
Is that the embassy behind it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole, this is a huge complex in downtown Guangzhou, which is, Guangzhou is mainland. It's across the Pearl River from Hong Kong. And it's the kind of epicenter of Chinese industrialism. It would have been, it was Canton, I think it was renamed. What does that say? From Michael to everyone.
Anya, maybe we should open it up, you think?
Yes, yeah, we have some questions from the audience. First, thank you so much, Michael and Joel, for this great conversation, for this review of the show. Our first question will come from Sharakat, and you should be able to turn on your microphone.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Joel. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Well, there's one thing I would like to ask you about is to speak about scale, because that's really something that always strikes me in your work. And I remember I think the first exhibition I've seen of your work was this installation you made at the Musée d'Orsay. What was that? I think 15 or 16 years ago, in this room with the sculpture of Carpeaux. So we were really into the monument. I mean, clearly 19th century monument context. And then when I saw your works in more gallery exhibition context, they were so small, very hand-sized sculptures, and it was totally different experience. And I would like to ask you about, what does it mean to you to work in such a small scale or huge monumental scale? Does it have to do with the context of the production, whether it's a commission or an independent work, or the criteria, and what does it mean to you? Because for me, it's physically such a different experience to see your works in such different scales.
Well, generally it's a commission. I mean, I don't work that large. Maybe that one piece that Michael and I were talking about, it would be about as large as I make something, unless really large would be a commission.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, you apply your thinking to that context. That exhibition of the d'Orsay was actually, those were commissioned.
Okay.
Serge commissioned artists to respond to something in the museum. And I actually, the little piece that I modeled that after, that I corresponded with the Carpeaux in terms of form, not reference, but form. Well, maybe reference, I don't know. And so I chose that piece because it was a corresponding use of form. So I don't think that, you know, the kind of dancing forms around a central figure is, you know, a very common sculptural form. It's something that seems to engage certain sculptors' minds, obviously. Yeah, you read them differently. I mean, certain work just can't become large. I think it's very specific what you really do make large. I mean, but generally it's commissioned.
So your work is mostly at a smaller, more body-like scale, and then it's scaled up for a specific project, for a specific space.
Well, I would then, well, sometimes I'd make a piece. I mean, I'm working on an installation, it's not a commission. Yeah, I would build a model and start thinking in that context. So it would be an application of what you know to that context. And I think basically the process is the same, except its execution is radically different. And you're not, I mean, you lose intimacy. Very few artists have intimacy on a large scale. Calder is a genius of that. I mean, Calder's really have playfulness and intimacy. De Suvero has that. It's very hard to do something big and haptic, or to retain a certain sense. You can do it with tool markings, and, how you treat the wood. Paint.
So Joel, do you feel that do you kind of renounce the idea, the possibility of intimacy then to begin with when you're dealing with a large scale piece? And
No.
just think about it differently. If you try, you're still working to get it in.
No, I mean, no, I don't. I think so. I mean, when I did the piece in Washington at the Holocaust Museum, so instead of having tool marks, because I was making the piece by hand, I cut the forms at a sawmill. So now you had saw marks, kerf marks on the piece. So it had a reference. It wasn't haptic, but it still had texture. No, I don't think you give it up. Sort of. I mean, no big work has that much intimacy, right?
Except architecture, I would say, because you're just contained into it.
Yeah, but architecture is different.
Yeah.
I mean, the architectural sculpture doesn't. If you go into an elevator, it's intimate. But I'm not so sure. But I don't see where sculptures. I think a lot of. I mean, I don't think the issue is intimacy as it is engagement. With large sculpture.
But one of the reasons why, I mean, I think that the Holocaust piece, it certainly has poignancy and maybe a certain amount of intimacy too. And it makes me think about, and that's in part because of the notion of separation, I think, of something completely blowing apart forever. And then it makes me wonder about this element of separation in your work, the way the more tenuous pieces are coming apart, or sort of, moving like it looks like they can break off and just separate. And I'm wondering about this notion of separation then, even as a sort of powerful, emotional, or poignant possibility or potential within the work, and how that can be communicated in a big piece or not.
Well, I think if you're pushing a piece visually, you'll also push it structurally. I mean, so you're sort of challenging structure when you're pushing your ideas, so you might sort of cantilever something way more than, so it becomes an engineering issue. I mean, to create a sense of play and suspense. No, does that? I mean, I think you can, remember, you can do stuff by hand in wood that will not necessarily translate into the real world. Or if it does translate into the real world, it's going to require, some mechanical aspects. But I'm supposed to get on the phone sometimes. No, I'm good. Oh, we have plenty of time. Okay.
I'm glad we have time because we have a couple of more questions.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Shirakat. Our next question will come from Lynn Crawford. You can turn on your microphone.
I'm looking for you.
Hi, Joel.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
This was fabulous. Thank you so much. And I guess my question kind of shifted now, hearing something you said, Michael, about it had to do with separation when you were talking about the Holocaust piece. And I was thinking how all this discussion about haptic and the physicality of your work, which is how it's always described. But when you say things like, I won't deny their woodenness, or some of the other things, they also could refer to very specific psychological states. And that's something that's always really impacted me with your work, is the way the physicality, which is almost, it's so, I don't want to say overwhelming, but it's so there that sometimes it's easy to forget that they're very astute psychologically. There's this whole psychological terrain that is referenced also in a very deft and, I find, moving and rigorous way. And I'm just curious if you could speak about that for a little bit.
Well, thank you. Well, I just, I mean, I just think every artist, when you're working, I mean, that's what you sort of put yourself into the work. And to some extent, work is about some self-identity, some sense of, you don't know what you want to do. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I should say, what one wants to do next. And you sort of, until you begin to work. And then, I mean, I think all art has a psychological profile. Some of it's flat and boring. Some isn't. I don't see how you can make a form and that form is not that who you, I mean, there's a kind of, it's like a complete profile of the person. Even if it's about denial. So it's a profile of denial. I think early work, I was really interested in that. I mean, I was sort of interested in, whatever state of mind I was in, seeing better than anything else. What else was I? I mean, write a novel? No. I mean, so somehow to find an equivalent form seemed to be. I think when I first got involved with using figures, I was interested in, I was doing small figures, then I had some moments of elation, so I made them larger. But I mean, somehow the possibility of communicating, that the sculpture could actually be a symbol for a state of mind. So it would have a kind of language. But I think that's, I mean, sculptors have been doing that forever. Bernini, Giacometti, sure. Even Rodin, stiff. Carl Andre, for sure. Anyway, I think the form is about a state of mind, which has some emotional implication. Does that answer it? No.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sort of, yeah. What just the one thing I'll just say that really strikes me is how varied the psychological states are. It's almost as if they're how I read them, as I have over the years anyway, is almost characters in a production rather than a self kind of expression. Obviously, characters are always some version, but that was just what struck me as the breadth. So anyway, thank you.
That's nice. I like that.
Thank you, Lynn, for an excellent question. Our next question comes from G.E. Schwartz. You can turn on your mic.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anya. And thank you, Joel and Michael and everybody for this. This is like so eye-opening and wonderful. I was thinking of Simone Weil's axiom that all natural movements of the soul are controlled by laws analogous to the physical gravity. And I was wondering, is your strategy been to explore our gravity-bound state and our longing for release?
It was more about sort of, yes, to some, I mean, you could see it that way, but it's more about overcoming the limitations of gravity in terms of the organization of form.
Mm.
That if you accepted flatness as a construct in sculpture, you know, you aren't going to get too far. All my work is flat, it has flat facets, but the organization of the form is not about flatness. And it just seemed to me to be something that one had to be aware of. And also, you know, and I know that Michael, other people, you know, there are two sculptors in the 19th century. There's Rodin, who's very plotting and tries to overcome gravity by just monumentality. And Degas, who does it via kind of projection of thought. I think they're both extraordinary artists. I'm not saying Rodin's not a great sculptor. He's one of the great sculptors. And the more I look at the work, the more I'm moved by the work. But there was a moment where I saw that as a sort of paradigm. I mean, I don't know. So somehow the idea that thought was not so conditioned by gravity, right? But form is conditioned by gravity. So how do you introduce thought into form? And I mean, it's complicated stuff. So my solution was simple: get pin guns, boom, bam, boom, fast.
You know, the mention of Simone Weil, it makes me think about her notion of force and her sort of, you know, her, like, that was the enemy, right? I mean, extreme sort of wariness of force as she understood it, and feeling that Joel's work is maintains some kind of like interesting dynamic conversation with that notion. And certainly in the provisional pieces, there's a complete avoidance of force as it would manifest itself in power, as it would manifest itself in control over other people. And then in the, you know, in the other works, there's a kind of circling around the various ways in which sculpture can actually relate to power and force in the way it has, without wanting to go there, you know, not without ever really going there, but maybe, and this is me, maybe in the more public, like monumental pieces, sort of getting closer to it, but moving away from it, but never really going there. So there's a wariness of it, or some real internalized sense of just not wanting sculpture to be that.
Well, you know, the smaller pieces that I did, the chair and this and that, those were really demanding on the audience. I mean, on the perceiver, right? You'd have to enter into this kind of magic. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. Because I showed them at Paula's years later. My dread fear was, you know, that they wouldn't work. They wouldn't condense space. They wouldn't pull you in, when in fact they did. But I mean, I stopped doing that because I thought that stuff was all, I thought maybe it was about magical thinking, but maybe I ran out of ideas. But anyway, but they would demand, they were pretty insistent. You know, you could look through these defended bunker and try to enter into that small space. That was asking for a lot. Somebody say so.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, G, for that question. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and for your comments in the chat. And again, thank you, Joel and Michael, for an excellent conversation today. This has been really a lovely way to start the week. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. It was engaging.
Definitely was.
Nerve-wracking, but engaging.
It was very smooth. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our events with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Hazem Fahmy, to the stage to close us out. Writer and critic from Cairo, Hazem Fahmy runs the media criticism newsletter Zam Zoom on Letterdrop. His debut chapbook, Red Jill Prayer, won the 2017 Diode Editions contest. A Kundiman and Watering Hole Fellow, his poetry has appeared or is forthcoming in the Best American Poetry 2020, AAWW, the Boston Review, and Perry Schooner. His criticism has appeared or is forthcoming in Movie Notebook, Reverse Shot, and Mizna, and his performances have been featured on Button Poetry and Right About Now. So Hazem, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be joining you. So glad to be closing out this great event. And wanted to give a quick thank you to Malvika for inviting me to participate in this. I deeply appreciate it. Right, so I have a few poems for y'all. Those are the day. My apologies, I pulled it up on my drive, but it decided to close. But okay, here it is. This first one is untitled. On the morning in which I began to seriously reckon with the violence of the empty condo, it was also the beginning of the season of interrupted travel, rebooked airplanes. I had never known the one-way flight to be such a sweet thrill. In a year of anguish, I received the gift of a mother who tells you, go and don't come back here, but call when you get there. To be heartbroken as the world burned and flooded was a comical grief. I learned the joy of an aching ankle, the unexpected delight of a bruised toe. The subway would rush right past me, and I would wave goodbye. The second one is also untitled. In the Red Square, my father tells me they moved Lenin's body away from all the churches to give him a proper Christian burial. Shortly after, a man dressed like him took 100 rubles from me and my dad photographed our handshake. Later, I uploaded to Facebook. In months, I returned to where the sky is adorned with flags of blood and war paint. Blue as an all-consuming ocean, white as an abyss. The next summer was one of melting ice cream, my hands fading out of the frame and back again, yours shaking as you barely held the camera. Driving through Florida, I asked George if they think nonviolence can ever work. My own bluntness catches in my throat. Years later, I would remember the woods we passed and how since I've become an alien to many, I've mistaken as friend, an enemy of the Arab nationalist who adores Salah ad-Din until he is told the man was Kurdish. Asked of countries, I would have once told you that I love mine like the army loves paperwork. And for a while there, I believed I did hold a love that was as sharp as the wind in Connecticut, thick as the chivalrous musk that cloaked sleepless nights and stale sheets. I asked God to make me believe I was going somewhere and not buried in Sinai. This one is called Cairo Station. Once a year, revisiting the possibility of my absence being permanent, my mother recounts the story of how I almost became a cautionary tale. About 7, I wandered off, becoming anonymous in the cacophony of the Cairo train station. This emblem of modernity, site of iconic cinematography, almost became my undoing, Had it not been for a man I do not remember. My mother found me beside him, the story goes, and did not stop to ask where exactly he'd found me, opting to snatch me in her arms for days on end instead. He could have been a good Samaritan or a phantom to haunt her dreams for the next 4 years. I am here, so it does not matter. This one is also entitled 1. In the dream, I am always faced with jagged skyscrapers beyond which lies a winding road, unfathomable at any state border. The nation unravels itself. Who killed Kennedy and the economy? You compulsively mince cabbage. You do not buy cabbage for the hilt of the knife. A labyrinth of contorted buildings. A horizon of impossible sunsets, Americana as a single fixed point. You stop by a diner at the world's end. You ask a clerk at the drugstore. The silence is stifling. In the afternoon, you think about peppers, mountains of lettuce in the Tupperware. Note, buy another week. Cut enough tomatoes to bruise your index from the hilt of the knife. In the dream, I am always faced with a labyrinth of contorted buildings, jagged skyscrapers beyond which lies a horizon of impossible sunsets, Americana as a winding road, unfathomable at any single fixed point. You stop by a diner at the state border, the nation unravels itself, world's end. You ask a clerk at the drugstore who killed Kennedy, and the silence is stifling. In the afternoon, you think about the economy. You compulsively mince peppers, mountains of lettuce in the Tupperware. Note, buy cabbage. You do not buy cabbage for another week. Cut enough tomatoes to bruise your index from the hilt of the knife. 2. In the graveyard on the hill, we sat on the ground and talked about nothing in particular. I imagine these tombstones to be part of a set, the scattered dead familial since their time began in the ground. You remark that all the color around seems to be fading except that of grass. It's spring, and we did not bring the champagne like we promised. I don't know yet what it means to miss Connecticut. It's fall. My dry skin pulsates on the dead grass. 3. In your palms, a field. And then this last poem is called California. How grotesque my laptop screen appears some mornings. I get out of bed reluctantly. A meeting is canceled and it feels like I have been gifted a second life. I tell my brother the beach looks like the end of the world, the border with oblivion, the last horizon of the frontier. If you watch the waves, it looks like the sand is being consumed, then regurgitated. I'm trying not to think of how this water hungers for the shore we stand on. When we were children, some men tried to teach us that life was but a breath, awaiting Gabriel's soft hands on the trumpet, awaiting the movement of holy brass. My friends have all told me that I would actually hate to live long enough to see everything become dust. I'm trying to believe them. Every day, I wish I could. In between my obsessive photographing, my brother asks, what kind of beauty are you waiting for? I say, the ocean is so wide, not even a bullet could cross it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hazem, for closing us out today. And thank you again, Joel and Michael. And thank you to Paula Cooper Gallery for helping to make this event possible today. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload today's conversation shortly. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation between Julian Schnabel, Donatien Grau, and Raphael Rubenstein on the occasion of the exhibition Self-Portraits of Others on View at the Brand Foundation. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Andrei Codrescu. And you can now turn on your microphone to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Hazem.
Great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Lynn.
you.
Bye.
Beautiful reading, beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Hazem. And thank you, Anya. Beautifully emceed as always.
Thank you, Anya.
Well, have a great afternoon. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. It's terrific.
Take care and be safe, everyone.
Bye.
You too, Nick. Bye-bye.